Something is happening across the Linux world right now in the summer of 2026, and if you've only glanced at the headlines, you have no idea how big it actually is. This isn't one story, it's 3 collisions happening at the exact same time. KDE is quietly finishing its own operating system. The Linux kernel just crossed 43 million lines of code and is about to hit version 7.2. And behind the scenes, some of the most respected names in open source just walked away from their own projects in public over a fight that has nothing to do with code at all. Put those 3 things together, and you start to understand why longtime Linux users are calling this one of the strangest, most consequential stretches the platform has seen in years. Let's start with the part almost nobody outside the KDE community has fully clocked yet. KDE isn't just a desktop anymore, it's building a full operating system, officially called KDE Linux. And as of the project's own June 2026 development update, it's now 78% of the way to its beta milestone. Read that again. Not a theme, not a spin, an entire ground-up operating system built by the same team behind Plasma, designed around atomic, image-based updates using BTRFS snapshots, meaning your system updates as one complete, verified block instead of thousands of individual packages that can silently break each other. That's the pitch anyway. And back in March 2026, KDE's own developers publicly admitted that pitch cracked under pressure. According to KDE developer Harold Sitter's own project update, several users experienced a run of bad updates that left their systems completely unbootable. The supposedly bulletproof atomic update system turned out to have a hidden failure mode. A bug in a newly released version of system caused one stage of the update to silently fail, while a later stage succeeded anyway, and a separate bug meant that rolling back to the last known good state could actually wipe out critical system files instead of restoring them. KDE's own team described the discovery bluntly, joking that of course their supposedly foolproof atomic updates turned out not to be so atomic after all. That's not a hit piece. That's KDE talking about its own project, in its own words, in public. But here's what makes this genuinely interesting instead of just embarrassing. They didn't hide it, and they didn't stop. By June 2026, the same monthly report described the project as running smoothly, with the team building an entirely new, automated QA system designed to catch exactly this kind of failure before it ever reaches a user's machine, converting the operating system's raw disk image into a hybrid format that also works as a standard installable ISO file, and hardening the underlying kernel configuration used specifically for KDE Linux. This is a small, still experimental operating system being built in full public view, mistakes included, by a team that seems determined to get it right rather than pretend it already is. And while that's happening underneath the surface, KDE's actual flagship desktop, Plasma, just had one of its biggest releases in years. Plasma 6.7 shipped on June 16, 2026, and according to KDE's own release notes, it finally delivers something users have been asking for since 2005, true per-screen virtual desktops. 21 years. That's how long this specific feature request has been sitting in KDE's collective memory before finally shipping. Alongside it, Plasma 6.7 introduces a new theming engine called Union, aiming to let developers style Plasma and its apps using standard CSS instead of juggling multiple incompatible theming systems, a quick toggle to instantly flip between light and dark global themes, meaningful Wayland refinements as KDE prepares to drop X11 support entirely in the upcoming Plasma 6.8, and a returning classic look, the air theme, for anyone who's been quietly missing it. On the surface, this looks like a routine, healthy release cycle for one of the most used desktop environments in the Linux ecosystem. And it is that. But it's also happening at the exact same moment the Linux kernel underneath it is going through something far messier and far more revealing about where this entire ecosystem is actually headed. Because right now, underneath every distro, every desktop, every KDE release, sits the Linux kernel itself. And the kernel just crossed a genuinely wild technical milestone. As of the release of Release Candidate 1 for version 7.2 on June 28, 2026, confirmed directly through Linus Torvalds' own announcement on the kernel mailing list, the Linux kernel source tree now contains more than 43 million total lines. Specifically, 43,595 lines by a raw count, or roughly 42.58 million. Lines using language-aware tooling that filters out comments and blank space. For comparison, the previous stable release, Linux 7.1, sat at just over 42.6 million lines. That's an increase of roughly 563,000 lines, about 1.3%, in a single 2-week merge window. 1/3 of that entire increase, according to Torvalds himself, is nothing but AMD GPU register. Definitions, the raw hardware description files needed to support new graphics chips. Even setting those aside, driver code still makes up more than half of everything added. This is a kernel that now runs everything from Raspberry Pis to hyperscale server racks, and it is still growing every single cycle without slowing down. And that raises the real question sitting underneath this entire story, the one we're about to dig into properly. If the code is growing this fast, and the desktop built on top of it is finally shipping features people have waited 2 decades for, why are some of the most important people behind Linux suddenly walking away from the project entirely? Here's where this story stops being about code and starts being about people. Because in the same window of time that KDE shipped its biggest desktop release in years and the kernel crossed 43 million lines, 2 of open source's most respected maintainers publicly resigned from their own projects, and the reasons why have split the Linux community right down the middle. The first resignation hit hardest because of who it came from. Hector Martin, the founder and lead developer of Asahi Linux, the project responsible for bringing full Linux support to Apple Silicon Macs, announced he was stepping down as project lead, effective immediately, as reported by Twitey's Untitled Linux show. In his own words, shared publicly, Martin said the project had become less fun over time, pointing specifically to mounting user frustration over incomplete support for newer M3 and M4 Apple chips and features that still hadn't landed. Read that again. This wasn't a project running out of money or losing relevance. Asahi Linux has been one of the most celebrated reverse engineering achievements in modern open source, turning locked-down Apple hardware into fully functional Linux machines. And its own founder walked away, citing burnout dressed up as declining enjoyment, a pattern anyone who has ever led an open source project will recognize instantly. The good news, and it matters, is that the project itself isn't ending. Leadership is passing to co-maintainer Sven Peter and developer Janne Grunau, who has been working on the project's downstream kernel since April 2026. Asahi Linux continues. Its founder just isn't the one steering it anymore. The second resignation is the one that actually detonated across Linux forums and social media, because it wasn't about burnout at all. It was about a single sentence. Carol Herbst, maintainer of the Nouveau driver, the open source graphics driver project for NVIDIA hardware, stepped down after another maintainer used the phrase, "We are the thin blue line," during a kernel development discussion. According to the same TOIT community breakdown of the incident, that phrase, commonly associated with pro-police messaging in the United States, landed very differently depending entirely on who was reading it. As one host on the show put it, trying to explain the disconnect to a global audience. In some regions, the phrase barely registers as political at all, and in others, it's read as openly charged, even hostile. Language, as one commentator on the discussion noted, simply evolves, and phrases that meant nothing to a person in their youth can quietly become loaded over time, sometimes without the speaker even realizing it. The hosts covering the fallout landed on a genuinely uncomfortable conclusion for an international community built entirely on remote collaboration. Demanding someone be pushed out of a project purely for a political phrase without any larger pattern of behavior behind it is a dangerous precedent to set, no matter which side of the phrase you land on. And yet the resignation happened anyway. The silver lining, similar to the Asahi situation, is structural resilience. Nouveau still has 2 remaining kernel maintainers, and development is already underway on Nova, a planned rewrite intended to eventually replace Nouveau altogether. But both of these resignations are really symptoms of a much bigger, slower-burning conflict that's been simmering across the entire kernel community for over a year now, the fight over Rust. Since 2022, the Linux kernel has slowly opened its doors to Rust, a modern programming language built around memory safety, as a supplement to the kernel's traditional decades-old C codebase. And that supplement has caused genuine, sustained friction. The core tension is simple to state and brutally hard to resolve. Rust's entire selling point is preventing the kind of memory safety bugs that have plagued C code for 50 years. But introducing it means asking veteran C maintainers, people who have reviewed tens of thousands of patches over their careers, to accept new tooling, new review burdens, and new failure modes they didn't sign up for. Christoph Hellwig, the kernel's DMA subsystem maintainer, became the public face of that resistance, rejecting Rust-related patches even when, as Linus Torvalds himself pointed out in a widely circulated response, those patches didn't touch Hellwig's own subsystem code at all. Torvalds' reply was blunt. A maintainer can choose to actively engage with Rust bindings touching their area, or step back and let them exist as any independent, complementary user of their code. But what a maintainer cannot do is veto Rust code simply because it exists nearby. The fact is, Torvalds wrote, the pull request you objected to DI'd not touch the DMA layer at all. Hector Martin, before his resignation, publicly urged the Rust for Linux team to push forward regardless, describing the I resistance in far sharper terms, and warning that no amount of pushback from what he called entrenched maintainers was going to reverse the industry's shift toward memory-safe languages. Miguel Ojeda, the developer most associated with the Rust for Linux project, has since published a formal Rust kernel policy specifically designed to head off future blowups. Like this one, clarifying that Rust for Linux is not an official initiative of the Rust Foundation, and that plenty of core kernel maintainers do actively support its presence in the tree. So layer all three of these together for a second. A beloved reverse engineering project loses its founder to simple exhaustion. A graphics driver loses its maintainer over a 7-word phrase that means something different depending on which country you're sitting in. And underneath both of them, a language war that's been quietly reshaping how kernel maintainers relate to their own code for the past 4 years. None of this is happening in a vacuum. And it's colliding right now with something else. A brand new kind of contributor that most kernel maintainers never had to deal with before. And that's testing the community's patience in an entirely different way. Here's the part of this story that genuinely surprised me while researching it, because it's not maintainers fighting maintainers anymore. It's maintainers fighting a flood of code and bug reports that nobody asked for, generated by tools that didn't exist in any serious form a few years ago. Back in April 2026, a developer submitted a clean, properly formatted patch to the Linux kernel with a reasonable commit message, the kind of submission that would normally sail through review without much drama, according to a widely discussed account published on Medium and picked up across Hacker News. The maintainers rejected it, not because it contained a bug, because they suspected it had been written by AI, and they weren't going to spend their limited review time untangling code from a system that, in their experience, tends to be most confident exactly where it's most dangerous. Here's the underlying problem, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Every experienced kernel maintainer carries what amounts to a mental pattern library built over decades, a catalog of exactly how humans screw things up. Off by one errors, forgotten lock releases, missing null checks after allocation. After tens of thousands of patch reviews, that pattern library becomes a kind of radar. AI-generated code doesn't trip that radar the same way, because its mistakes aren't shaped like human mistakes. They're novel, unfamiliar failure modes hiding inside code that reads as perfectly clean and well-formatted, which, if anything, makes them harder to catch, not easier. And this wasn't an isolated incident. It became a defining friction point of the entire Linux 7.1 release cycle. According to OS Technic's own coverage of the Linux 7.1 release, which shipped on June 14, 2026, Linus Torvalds himself expressed open frustration during that cycle about the volume of AI-generated bug reports flooding in, many of them essentially duplicates, produced by different people, running the same automated tools against the same code base and submitting near-identical findings as if they were original discoveries. Torvalds' message to the community was direct: read the documentation, understand what you're actually reporting, and if you're going to use these tools, pair them with a real fix, not just an automated alert dropped into an already overloaded inbox. It's a strange, very 2026 kind of maintainer burden. Not malicious contributions, not incompetent ones. Just an overwhelming volume of technically plausible noise that still has to be individually triaged by human beings, whose time is the scarcest resource in the entire project. Now here's where all of this lands, in the kernel itself, right now, in the summer of 2026. Linux kernel 7.1 shipped on June 14th with nearly 13,000 individual changes from more than 2,000 developers, over 300 of whom were contributing for the very first time, according to OS Technic's detailed release coverage. That release made Intel's flexible return and event delivery, or FRED, the default handling mechanism for certain system transitions, added a completely new in-kernel, NTFS implementation, and, notably, stripped out support for Intel's ancient 486-era processors entirely, along with more than 140,000 lines of other obsolete legacy code. 2 weeks later, on June 28, 2026, Torvalds opened the very first release candidate for Linux 7.2, and that's the release where the numbers start to feel almost absurd. The kernel source tree crossed 43,179,595 total lines by a raw count. Roughly 42.58 million of those lines count as actual language-aware code once you strip out comments and blank space, according to independent analysis published by OS Technics. To put the growth in context, Linux 7.1 sat at about 42.6 million lines. In a single 2-week merge window, the kernel grew by roughly 563,000 lines, about 1.3%, pulled from patches submitted by more than 200 subsystem maintainers. And yes, a full third of that growth is nothing more exciting than raw AMD GPU register definitions, the tedious hardware description tables new graphics chips require. But even stripping those out entirely, driver code still accounts for more than half of everything added. This is the tension that defines the modern Linux kernel in one sentence. It keeps growing at a genuinely startling pace, while its maintainers are simultaneously fighting to remove anything obsolete, filter out an unprecedented flood of AI-assisted noise, and hold together a global, unpaid, volunteer-driven review culture that was never designed to operate at this scale or speed. Following its usual pattern, the 7.2 kernel is expected to move through roughly 7 to 8 weekly release candidates before landing as a stable release sometime between August 16th and August 23rd, 2026, according to 9to5Linux's own reporting, based directly on Torvalds' release cadence. Torvalds himself described the opening of this cycle as reasonably normal, a phrase that, in context, is almost funny given everything else happening around it. So here's where all three threads of this story, the KDE operating system quietly stabilizing after its own public stumble, the maintainer resignations, exposing real fractures in how this global volunteer community handles conflict, and a kernel, ballooning past 43 million lines while fighting off an AI-shaped flood of low-quality contributions, actually converge into one single, much bigger question about where Linux goes from here. So step back for a second and look at everything sitting on the table right now in July 2026, because none of it is actually separate. KDE is building its own operating system in full public view, and it already survived a serious, embarrassing failure. Systems left completely unbootable by a bug hiding in the interaction between system and KDE Linux's own atomic update system. And instead of quietly burying that failure, the team documented it, root caused it, and kept shipping. As of the project's own June 2026 report, KDE Linux now sits at 78% toward its beta milestone, with a new automated QA system nearly ready to catch exactly this category of failure before it ever reaches a real user's machine. At the exact same time, KDE's flagship desktop, Plasma, just delivered features people have been requesting since 2005, 21 years of patience finally paying off in a single release. That's not a project in decline, that's a project stress testing itself in public and getting stronger for it. But underneath that desktop sits a kernel going through something far less comfortable. Two respected maintainers, Hector, Martin from Asahi Linux, and Carol Herbst from Nouveau, walked away from their own projects within the same general window, one from simple accumulated exhaustion, the other from a 7-word phrase that meant something different depending entirely on which country you happened to be reading it from. Neither project collapsed. Asahi Linux continues under new leadership. Nouveau still has active maintainers, and Nova is already being built as its eventual successor. But both resignations are visible symptoms of a much larger ongoing fight over Rust's place inside a 50-year-old C-dominated codebase. A fight serious enough that Linus Torvalds himself has had to step in and draw explicit lines around what a maintainer can and cannot veto. And now, layered on top of all of that, is something genuinely new. An unprecedented wave of AI-generated code and AI-generated bug reports that doesn't trip the mental pattern library kernel maintainers have spent decades building to catch human mistakes, forcing Torvalds to publicly ask contributors to slow down, read the documentation, and stop flooding. An already overloaded review pipeline with duplicate, automated noise. Meanwhile, the kernel itself keeps growing anyway, now sitting at more than 43 million lines, as of the Linux 7.2 release candidate on June 28, 2026. With a final stable release expected sometime between August 16th and August 23rd, new hardware support keeps pouring in, obsolete code keeps getting stripped out. More than 2,000 developers, over 300 of them brand new to the project, contributed to the most recent stable release alone. This is a project that is simultaneously larger, faster growing, and more actively maintained than it has ever been in its history, while also visibly straining under interpersonal conflict and a flood of low-quality automated contributions that simply didn't exist as a problem 5 years ago. Here's why all of this actually matters to you, even if you've never compiled a kernel or touched a KDE settings menu in your life. Linux quietly runs the overwhelming majority of the world's cloud servers, every Android phone, and a growing share of desktops migrating away from Windows 11's more restrictive requirements and Copilot-driven direction. Every one of these threads, KDE's new operating system stabilizing in public, maintainers walking away over unresolved cultural fault lines, a kernel ballooning in size while fighting off AI-shaped noise, feeds directly into whether the software running underneath your phone, your router, your favorite streaming service, and increasingly your desktop stays healthy, secure, and actively maintained for the next decade. This isn't an abstract developer squabble happening somewhere far away from your life. It's the operating system layer of the modern internet, visibly working through growing pains in real time and mostly doing it in public, which, frankly, is more than most closed-source platforms ever offer you. So here's where that leaves things in the middle of 2026. KDE Linux is closing in on its beta milestone with a hardened QA system nearly ready and a hybrid ISO format already built to make testing dramatically easier for anyone curious enough to try it. Plasma 6.8 is already being planned with Kato Wind set to drop desktop OpenGL support entirely as the project pushes further into a Wayland-only future. Linux kernel 7.2 is working through its release candidate cycle right now, with a stable release landing in late August, and kernel 7.3 already forming behind it, quietly adding more graphics hardware IDs, and pushing RISC-V's default core limit higher than ever before. And the human side of this story, the maintainer resignations, the Rust policy debates, the AI contribution flood, isn't resolved. It's ongoing, messy, and if the last 18 months are any indication, likely to produce at least one more headline-grabbing flashpoint before the year is out. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about where this platform is actually headed, not just the surface-level release notes. So subscribe, because the Linux 7.2 stable release, KDE Linux's beta launch, and whatever comes next in the Rust and maintainer story are all landing within the next couple of months, and you'll want to be here when they do. Drop a comment and tell me honestly, does KDE building its own full operating system excite you, or does it worry you that KDE is stretching itself across a desktop, an app suite, and now an entire OS all at once? I'll be reading every single reply.